Okay, 1:10, it says on my computer, so time to start. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the most dangerous time of the day to hold a presentation because everyone has had their lunch. And the further back you sit, the sounder you can sleep. Anyway, I'm Lena Adamson. I'm Associate Professor of Psychology. Why I'm here is probably because my former position was as head of the Swedish Institute of Educational Research up till about 1 year ago. But I was invited here this year again by Eva Hartell. So I'm actually going to talk about stuff that I haven't talked about before. So I'm going to keep fairly strict to my papers. I'm also going to keep very strict around here. There are instructions because they are filming. So, as you can see, I have changed my title a little bit from research-based school leadership to leadership for research-based education to broaden the perspective a little bit. As opposed to the speaker before lunch, I am actually going to read what it says on my PowerPoints. 2 reasons for that. The human brain cannot handle 2 messages, 2 senses at the same time. So if you read something, you won't listen to what I say and the other way around. So I try to synchronize that fairly much. But of course, the other reason is, as I said, also that this is a new area for me. I haven't talked such a lot about these issues before. Can I ask how many school leaders do we have in the room? Do we have any? Oh, wow, great. Good. But as I said, I broadened the perspective a little bit, and school leadership is not necessarily the same as a principle. School leadership we can also look upon as a function, where quite a few people at the school are involved, of course. So what I'm going to talk about today here is this. I'm going to start with just giving the background a little bit. Where did it all start, this research-based education? I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between evidence and evidence-based practice. Say a few words about how we can characterize a research-engaged school in relation to other schools. I'm going to comment on a model by David Goffrey over what he calls nutrients of the research-engaged school culture. I'm going to give you a definition of how I view practice-based school research. Then I'm going to summarize a little bit, of course, and give some tips and tricks for the daily life of a school leader and possibly also for teachers to be useful for that. I'm going to finish with a very short message to our politicians. So, where did it all start, this research-based education, you may ask? Well, in a way you can say that it started in 2010. And of course, it started much earlier because research on and for education has gone for a long, long time, of course. But what I mean is, when did it really hit the Swedish school system? And in that way, you can say that it started in 2010, because that's when the Swedish Parliament adopted a new Education Act, where it actually says that education should rest on scientific ground and proven experience. When I was appointed as Director General of the Institute, I previously came from the higher education sector. May I just ask you, how many know what the Swedish Institute for Research on Education is? So okay, I'll just say a few words about that. It's one of the 4 governmental authorities we have for the Swedish school system, and it was started in 2015. It's got 2 main tasks, and that is to fund practice-based school research, and it is to produce systematic reviews basically on teaching and learning, not for the sort of whole school system and education and all that, but for stuff that basically happens in the classroom. So anyway, when I took up that position, I was very familiar with the Swedish teacher training program, and with its flaws, if I may say. But this was the first time that I sort of stepped into the Swedish school system with both feet, so to speak. And I found very quickly that this Parliament decision from 2010, that education should rest on scientific ground, was far from implemented. On the contrary, almost every conference that I was invited to in my new position, and they were many, had a title that referred to this scientific ground. And there was almost always a question mark after the title. Everyone was sort of still wondering, what is it really, this scientific ground? I'm currently engaged in some activities with a fairly large group of school principals, and I find the same almost 4 years later. I do not say this as a critique to any teachers or to any individual school leaders. Far from it. But I do say that we have soon lost 10 years in developing more research-based schools and more research-based teaching due to that originally a very sound political decision, in my mind. They seldom, at least when it comes to education, are followed by an equally sound implementation plan. Of course, there was no such implementation plan to this bill when it went to the Parliament in 2010. And in my mind, instead of relying on some sort of a self-organizing system here, I believe that a number of higher education institutions should have been commissioned to collaborate with schools on this. And I believe that this is still one of the core issues in creating both research-informed school leadership and the same, of course, for the teaching. But of course, there has to be other reasons too than just a political decision for us to do something. So the real reasons for using research in your practice is, well, for a start, if we don't do it, schools and education will continue to be ruled very much by ideologies, by fads, by buzzwords, by personal opinions, etc., etc. Things that can be good. The problem is we don't know if they're good, and they might even be bad, but we don't know. So that's the main reason, really, I would say. But there are other reasons, of course. We want to find the best bets for what promotes learning, which in turn will make that we use our resources much more effective. And we will develop a more professional language, which means that education will become looked upon as more professional by others. And that in turn will give both school leaders and teachers more autonomy. Something that we talk a lot about in Sweden, that teachers and school leaders should have a lot of autonomy. I think you agree with me that there is not so much autonomy. There is loads of regulations and new reforms coming all the time. As you can hear, I prefer to speak about research and research-based or research-informed, if you want, rather than this scientific ground, which I find is a bit more obscure. It's a lot further away from the school reality. Before I continue, let me be clear about that I am really fully aware of that school leadership very often, by necessity, is much more driven by finding solutions of daily problems rather than the strategic planning maybe and the use of different kinds of management models. But maybe just because of this, a few words on how to organize your schools and what to think of as a school leader when it comes to the use of research may be useful for you. Before we go into that a little bit more, I want to define two terms here, so that we're speaking the same language, at least when we're meeting up here. Evidence and evidence-based practice. I think there's quite a lot of misunderstandings in the educational context when we use the word evidence. It sort of seems to evoke emotions when you say it, either good or bad emotions. But I think the main point is that evidence does not mean proof as in 100% true. It means more a strong indication. And if we speak Swedish, I would use the word belägg rather than bevis. That's really important to remember when we talk about evidence. Of course, evidence should be 100% true if you're within the legal system. But now we're talking about teaching education. Evidence-based practice, on the other hand, is a much broader concept and always includes three parts. It includes the evidence, but it also includes the practitioner's knowledge and experience, whether you're a school leader or a teacher. It also includes a third part: the background, the knowledge, the experience, the opinions from the third party in the educational context, the students, the pupils, and for a school leader, of course, the teachers. In the medical context, it's the patient. So evidence-based practice means to merge these three parts together, which of course means that the results from research, the evidence, always have to be adapted into a context. And that's really important to remember, because I still find that the discussion around this sometimes is a bit infected. So if we go on and look a little bit of what can define a research-engaged school in relation to other schools. And when I'm talking here, I'm talking about research-engaged schools. I'm not talking about schools as research institutions, because that's a much longer way to go. I hope we get there, but let's start to see to that all our schools really are research-engaged. I found this definition by somebody called Raphael Wilkins some time ago, that such a school promotes practitioner research among its staff. And it encourages, of course, its staff to read and be responsive to published research. And it welcomes, as a learning opportunity as well as a responsibility to the wider educational community, and I think that's a really wise point to make here, being the subject of research by outside organizations as well. And it uses research to inform its decision-making at every level. It also has an outward-looking orientation, including research-based links with other schools and universities. I agree with all those points, but I would probably list it in a different order. I would start off with encouraging your staff to read and be responsive to published research, and I would put as the last point, promotes practitioner research amongst its staff. The reason for that is that I don't believe that a large part of the school leader or the teacher community should be doing research. The large part of these two communities should, of course, lead their schools and teach. I've written 20% versus 100% there. What do I mean with that? Well, I think it's probably reasonable to maybe have around 20% of your staff, of your teacher, to be involved in some sort of research. Not necessarily 20% these individuals all the time. Could be, you could change around the roles. But of course 100% should be able to use existing research in their teaching. And the same for school leaders, for principals, of course. 100% ought to be able to use already existing research. That's another reflection I have from my time at the Institute, that the discourse, the way we talk about research in schools here in Sweden, is very focused on teachers actually doing research. I never really hear somebody giving the same message as I try to, which I've repeated a number of times by now, that we need to develop teachers' capacity and opportunities to use already produced research. Give them the tools, so to speak. Because reading up on and using research is also the platform you need if you actually want to engage in research. Whether you want to develop your field or to replicate or adapt something into your own context. This is a very common mistake amongst university students when they write up their final thesis. They invent the wheel all the time. I think we should not foster that in schools. So let's start with building the capacity for finding, reading up and using research before actually doing research. And when I say reading up, of course, I mean to be able to read it critically and appraise it in different ways. So the school leaders' roles and responsibilities then, what I find. Well, I think you are responsible to see, too, that all of your teachers are well informed and know how to use research results within their fields of teaching. But of course, just to add on that to the existing demands on already hard-pressed staff usually, won't work in the long term. So what is needed is to integrate this. It's an integration of research activity into the existing system. And that means you need defined times for it, of course, and you need defined fora for it. The second one is that I think you should see to that on a regular basis you have some sort of research and development projects going on at your schools. And there is not a defined sort of border in between what is research and what is developmental projects, especially when you're out in practice, whether it's schools or something else. That's a sort of a floating issue. So how do we feed the system to shape a research-engaged school culture? David Godfrey suggests that you need to look at 4 elements. You need to look at leadership, you need to look at teacher professionalism, you need to have some systemic aspects, and you need to have organizational aspects. And I don't intend to go through his whole model. I'm going to mention a few things here. What is marked out in blue, actually. So let's start looking at the leadership box. What do you need to think of here as a school leader? Well, you need to start building capacity. I'm sorry, something happened to my timer here and I want to... Okay. You need to start building the capacity. You need to find the right persons in your organization. Find persons who are already sort of on the track and who has legitimacy amongst their colleagues, of course. And give them a clearly defined task to begin with, to keep themselves updated on relevant research and communicate this in a systematic way. And when I say relevant, what is relevant? Well, I think you need to think very much demand-driven here. Demand-driven by teachers and by yourself. Research on topics that you and your teachers need to know more about. There's a lot written about educational leadership. And I find it quite hard sometimes to keep track of all the different models and different types. But David Godfrey recommends distributed leadership in this context, and I totally agree with that, of course. And the larger the school you are in charge of, the more persons you need to encourage for this, of course. But again, find the right people for this and don't let go of them. Don't let go of them. You need to be part of their work, because I think this may be a common mistake, that somebody is divided to do this. Somebody is financed to part of their time they go to one of the research doctoral trainings, and you sort of leave it there and feel that now we are sort of research basing our school. Don't do that. You need to get it into your organization, into your system. So it's not just about appointing a person to coordinate the school's research. It's about building a strong system to encourage new uptake of research into the school's strategic planning and into the practice. So that's a start, I think. Create your organization around these issues so that you feel confident that you have it in place. And I'm sure lots of school leaders has an organizational chart. If you don't, make one and see to that you put this function into your organizational chart so you know that's where it is. That's how it hangs together with the rest of the organization. One common mistake I find is easy to do here. It's to become much too theoretical and to choose too broader perspectives. I think it's quite good to start differentiating between theories, like learning theories, developmental theories, management theories, you know what I mean, on the one hand. On the other hand, the results from empirical studies. Theories you need as a basis for your understanding, of course. And if we should be frank about it, you should know your theories already. You should have that from your educational background, really. Once you start looking for the results from empirical studies, you sort of move into the real world. And then you need to be specific. Here are some examples. And I don't mean that it's necessarily these issues that you should sort of go home and dig into. There are examples of types of questions. I have given you the web links if you want to read more, read up on these issues. But as I said, these are more like examples of types of more specific questions. I've heard a number of times teachers asking why they need to use research when the research is not relevant for what they are teaching. And of course, it should be relevant. So, for instance, what should we think of if we introduce teacher assistants? I'm sure you're all involved in that. How can I develop my students' ability for mathematical reasoning in primary education? What do I need to know when I have highly gifted or highly able students in my class? Those are issues that can make a difference in what you're actually doing with the pupils, the students at your schools. So find specific topics or questions you want to know more about. Ask your maybe newly appointed person who is research responsible at your school to find the latest research on this and give you a short presentation. Now I'm sort of addressing myself to the principal, give you a short presentation. Because as a leader, I've always said that you need to be like a journalist. You need to know 10 lines about everything, really. And here you need to be on top of things. You need to know a little bit about this. Of course, it's the teachers who should become the real professionals on the different topics, but it's good that you also stay updated on these things. Also, there is an awful lot of research for school leadership, for principals. So of course, you need to know what's the latest on those issues as well. And you can't do that on your own. You need to have somebody who is professional and has time for this and to give you brief summaries. Okay, then, next box. Teacher professionalism. What do you need to think of here? Well, here I think you need to be engaged in a conversation with your teachers to create a common understanding of how to look upon research evidence. Informed but not dictated to by research evidence, Godfrey says. And that's pretty much just a repetition of what I mentioned before about evidence-based practice. And this is a bit funny, actually, because as soon as you read about the use of research in schools and in education, every author is very, very careful about this, repeats this all the time, and very often also strongly objects to the mechanical, top-down, cookbook use of research evidence. Well, the funny part is that I've so far never seen anyone who actually says the opposite, that we should be mechanical and use a top-down approach to this. But it is always, I read a new book only a few days ago, and there was a whole chapter on this. It's an important message, of course, but I think we all understand that, really. If we move into the systemic aspects then. Well, schools are of course an integrated part of a wider system, not isolated units. So this you cannot do on your own. Maybe you can do it on your own, but will become a lot better if you don't do it on your own. Open up your schools for different networks with other schools and other collaborations, but of course also with the research community. So how do you do the latter? Collaborate with the research community, I was asked by one principal not long ago. Researchers are only interested in school research if it fits into the programs that they're already doing, this principal said. And yes, that is sadly true of many researchers, but I do feel that over maybe just a few years back, really, there is a change. Practice-based school research has sort of moved up a little bit more on the agenda. You can actually find researchers, especially here, I would say, but also at other places, that are interested in doing practice-based school research. But how do you go about this to find them? Well, again, find the right person. I've always said that everything boils down to the people who are involved, whatever you're doing. So you need to find the right person, not just find a researcher. You need to shop around. And you need to read up and show your competence on what you want to know more about and what you want to develop at your schools. And you need to tell these researchers what type of research you are interested in. You need to discuss these things before you actually start with a project. The trouble we have, I think, is that, again, we are about to create, or maybe have already created, a new buzzword here, which is practice-based research. I want to show you a definition of, and I really don't know why I've made that yellow. I hope you can still read it. But this is the definition I used when we developed the grant proposal process at the Institute. This is research that should emanate from the questions and challenges which school professionals encounter on a daily basis. So it's research that emerges from school activities. And it's research that school professionals can use to improve their methods and working practices, as well as their ability to make professional assessments and decisions, of course, regarding the pupil's development and learning. It's research that presupposes school structures and resources, and is grounded in a symmetrical partnership between school professionals and researchers. And I think that's probably the most important point, what I call the symmetrical partnership, the symmetrical relationships, where researchers, professional researchers, and school professionals are on the same level in the relationship, realizing, both parties realizing that both perspectives are needed to create the best practice research. Because researchers who don't work in a school, they don't really know what you need to know more about. So they need school professionals. But the school professionals are, of course, not researchers and cannot formulate the research questions and design the study. So you really need to work close with each other. And I think we still have a fairly long way to go there, because very often both parties somehow adopt an asymmetrical relationship, where the researchers come in and we know so much. And both parties have a responsibility here to sort of even that out, which means that you need to create long-term collaborations, because it's when you get to know each other that you can do that. This is the sort of research that can also initiate the emergence of new research environments. I said in the beginning that I'm basically talking about research-engaged schools here, not research schools. But of course, we could slowly move into that. And the results, I think, should be intended to have impact on school practices in a fairly short to medium-term period, maybe 1 to 5 years. This is not research that should sort of lie around and be developed for years and years and something comes out of it later on. We need all the theoretical or the systemic research as well, but this should be something that you can use fairly soon. One of the requirements when applying for grants at the Institute during my time, I have to add, I think and hope it's still like that, was that you needed a contract that was signed by the principals of the schools that were involved in the projects. You wouldn't go through the review process if you didn't have that contract. And in the first 2 rounds, had a yearly grant proposal. 554 such contracts were signed. After the first round, which was probably about 200 contracts or something like that, can't quite remember, we did a little follow-up and we asked all the people who didn't receive money, because the funding is very, very limited. But we asked them, so what happened to these collaborative projects? Have you stopped now just because you didn't get any money or not? And as far as I remember, I think it was like maybe 50 or 60% of the people who answered, the principals and the researcher, and they said, no, we go on. We will still collaborate. We can't do it in the grand way we would have been able to do if we got the research grant, but we will go on collaborating. And these are the sort of relationships, collaborations we really, really need to build between the schools and the research community. So, if we summarize a little bit here, as a school leader, I think you have a choice. As a school leader, you have a really sort of great influence on your school and, in the long run, on what happens with your pupils and their learning and their development. So you can lead by example, of course, by formulate visions and set up the right structures and organization to support sharing and dissemination and impact of research. And I think you do have a choice. And I think it's probably a pretty rhetorical question. You can view research engagement in one of two ways: as an additional effort and distraction from more pressing educational obligations, or as a very powerful and effective instrument to underpin all the activities in your school. So you need to reflect and make up your mind, and those of you who are not principals here, you need to convince your principals that this is the case, of course, that you need to get it into your organization. It's nothing sort of on the side. It's nothing, oh, the Educational Act says so, we need to do something about that. This is something that should really be built in and influence and help you doing what you're doing in a better way. A few tips and tricks. When someone makes a claim, ask them why they think like that. What evidence do they have to support their thinking? And of course, make space for professional dialogue, for example, in staff meetings around these issues. And encourage staff to share and reflect on their practices, for example, through observation and mentoring. And of course, principals need to also observe. But that you need to do in a systematic way, and I actually added a web link there to a fairly new report on teacher observations. You need to demonstrate, of course, that you value research yourself and refer to research findings and show that you're using evidence in your own decision making. And of course, this is not just for principals or school leaders, it's for teachers. Use this in relation to your colleagues. Make a commitment. This is the difficult one for all of us. Make a commitment to listen to and act on the results of research, even if they challenge your views and practices. That's a really difficult one, isn't it? Okay. I have a final message to our politicians, local or national. Do we have any politicians here? Good. Listen closely and take it to your colleagues. This is how you can affect systemic educational change, through top-down support for bottom-up change, not by more reforms. We're living in dangerous times when we have a new government, whatever new government we have, because that's the time when new reforms starts to ball up. But I think it's the top-down support we need, not the new regulations. So anyway, I usually leave time for questions, but we need to finish the talk first, I think. So I would just like to thank you very much for this. And then we can have some questions afterwards. Thank you. Okay, do we have any questions?